Make sure we know that's working. So the Committee on House Administration will come to order. I would like to note that a quorum for this hearing is present, and I'd like to say good afternoon to everyone. As we begin, I want to note that we're holding this hearing in compliance with the regulations for remote committee proceedings pursuant to House Resolution 8. Generally, we ask committee members and witnesses to keep their microphones muted when not speaking to limit background noise, and members will need to unmute themselves when seeking recognition or when recognized for their 5 minutes. Witnesses will also need to unmute themselves when they are recognized for their testimony or when they're answering a question. Members and witnesses, please keep your cameras on at all times. Even if you need to step away for a moment, please do not leave the meeting or turn your camera off. I'd also like to remind members that the regulations governing remote proceedings require that we can't participate in more than one committee proceeding at the same time. So at this time, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and have any written statements be made part of the record, and hearing no objection, that is so ordered. So today we are examining ways in which we can work to strengthen our American democracy, including H.R. 1, the For the People Act of 2021. Despite facing a once-in-a-generation pandemic, more Americans voted in 2020 than ever before, taking advantage of every avenue available to them to cast their ballot. However, increased voter turnout does not mean that barriers do not persist. And the 2020 election showed us that when barriers are removed and voters are given options for when and how to cast their ballot, options that acknowledge how voters live and work in the 21st century, participation in our democratic process increases while still maintaining the security and integrity of elections. Congress can't allow that access to now be rolled back. Despite no credible evidence of any irregularities in the 2020 election, states are introducing suppressive voting legislation at an alarming rate. Bills that, if they were to become law, would almost certainly disenfranchise voters under the guise of election integrity. According to a February 24th report published by the Brennan Center for Justice, states have introduced, pre-filed, or carried over more than 250 bills this year with provisions that restrict voting access, well over 4 times the number of bills to restrict voting access as compared to roughly the same time last year. The sentiment that new restrictive voting laws are necessary for election integrity is at best misguided. The 2020 election was secure and fair. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency and other election experts have said that the 2020 election was, quote, the most secure in American history. They also said, quote, America, we have confidence in the security of your vote, and you should too. Additionally, the 2020 election was inundated with more than $750 million in undisclosed dark money. That figure may be higher. In total, roughly $14 billion was spent during the last election, an unprecedented amount of money. Now is the time to take much needed steps forward, not backward. It's time, really past time, to break down the persistent structural barriers that create and perpetuate inequitable access to the ballot and that disenfranchise communities. Trust in government is tragically low. We must also bolster our election security and infrastructure, shine a light on dark money in our politics, and ensure every American has an equal voice in the political process. We need to strengthen congressional and executive branch ethics. H.R. 1 does all of this. The For the People Act sets a national standard that all voters have access to the same set of baseline options for casting their ballot. I applaud our colleague, Congressman John Sarbanes of Maryland, for his work in bringing this bill forward last Congress and again in this Congress. H.R. 1 is a landmark package of pro-democracy, pro-voting policies that will strengthen our democracy, increase access to the ballot for all eligible voters, and set as a standard many of the policies already utilized during the 2020 election and elections prior to expand access for all voters. To improve federal elections, H.R. 1 increases and improves access to voter registration opportunities, including online voter registration, automatic voter registration, and same-day registration. It implements a nationwide standard of no excuse absentee voting with a requirement for return envelopes and prepaid postage. Provides a minimum 15 days of early voting that must include weekend days. It sets a minimum standards for the number and deployment of drop boxes, improves access for voters with disabilities, addresses challenges faced by Native American voters living on Indian lands, creates a grant program for the training and recruitment of poll workers, re-enfranchises millions of voters who've completed their sentences but who are still barred from voting because of prior felony convictions, and ends the practice of disenfranchising voters because of these prior convictions. It unrigs the political system by establishing independent redistricting commissions so voters choose their congressional representatives, not the other way around. Bolsters election security, shines a light on dark money in our politics by reforming campaign finance laws, and gives an equal voice to small donors and everyday Americans. It prevents future foreign interference in our elections and strengthens congressional and executive branch ethics. These are just a handful of the many pro-democracy provisions included in H.R. 1. Many of these policies are bipartisan. Some have been pending and discussed in Congress for years, but were met with inaction. A number of states have already implemented some of these measures and have done so quite successfully. Congress must do its part to protect and defend the right to vote, to ensure that we as a country live up to our democratic principles and ideals, and ensure each and every American has free, fair, and secure access to the ballot. I look forward to working with my colleagues to ensure we do just that, and to hearing from our witnesses as to how we can strengthen American democracy. And I would now recognize our ranking member, Mr. Davis, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to all of the witnesses and also to the new members of the committee here at this first hearing. Next week, the House will be considering H.R. 1, a bill filled with 800 pages of election mandates and free speech regulations. Yet this is the only hearing this committee will have on the issue. And despite the bill changing from last Congress, we won't be marking up this bill that will impact millions of Americans' right to vote and to participate in the political process. If this bill were to become law, it will be the largest expansion of the federal government's role in elections that we have ever seen in our nation's history. The only thing more disappointing than the process is the bill itself. H.R. 1 federally mandates how states run their elections and forces a one-size-fits-all election system in our country, which is not only unconstitutional, but can lead to chaos and confusion for voters. H.R. 1 mandates automatic voter registration, allows 16-year-olds to register to vote, mandates same-day voter registration, automatically gives felons the right to vote, forces states to count provisional ballots cast outside of the correct precinct, mandates vote by mail with prepaid postage, requires 2 weeks of early voting, extends election day, defeats state voter protections such as voter identification, prohibits witnesses, signature verification, requirements for mail or absentee ballots, mandates ballot drop boxes, legalizes ballot harvesting, removes states' ability to determine their own redistricting procedures, makes the FEC a partisan agency, weaponizes the IRS to allow them to go after conservatives, creates a speech czar at the FEC. The list goes on and on. We'll hear testimony from the only person who has experience administering elections on why these one-size-fits-all policies simply won't work for every state, and why these decisions should be left to states to determine what works best for their voters. So in 2020, we saw chaos in our elections. States that were not accustomed to vote by mail struggled to implement it. This led to chaos in elections throughout the country and weakened voter confidence in the process, a real threat to democracy. Hundreds of thousands of people were unintentionally disenfranchised. Many ballot integrity safeguards were abandoned, and election results took weeks, and as we saw in New York, sometimes months to determine. In lawsuits across the country, courts ruled against many of these changes, including in the state of Maine, as groups filed to extend Maine's ballot receipt deadline, which this bill will do. The judge ruled against extending Maine's election day, saying in part, the harm to the state's electoral process outweighs the minor burdens imposed by those laws on the right to vote. And the Democrat Secretary of State at the time agreed, saying, this is a bit of a relief for us. H.R. 1 makes pandemic-style voting permanent. We had observers in New York and California and Pennsylvania and other parts of the country. And I think I speak for many Americans when I say, I don't want an election process like that again. But if H.R. 1 were to become law, it's exactly what the American people would get. We'd get a process that the American people don't trust. Beyond providing more distrust in our election administration process, this bill gets the federal government involved, directly contributing to congressional campaigns. H.R. 1 would launder corporate dollars through the Treasury and use those dollars to publicly fund congressional campaigns, adding roughly $5 million to my colleagues' campaigns by providing a 6-to-1 funding match to small donations. I know when I'm speaking with my constituents, establishing a program that helps me get more funding for my campaign is not what they think the federal government should be working on. But that's the Democrats' top priority. Under this bill, not only is the federal government deciding and providing direct contributions to congressional campaigns, but it's also now imposing heavy-handed rules to severely restrict free speech. H.R. 1 would impose vague standards that disadvantage all groups who wish to advocate on behalf of any legislative issue, specifically requiring them to disclose the names of donors who donate above a certain threshold. It weaponizes the IRS by permitting the agency to investigate and consider the political and policy persuasions of organizations before granting tax-exempt status, taking us all back to the ill-fated Lois Lerner years. Federal Election Commission will be partisan. H.R. 1 altered the bipartisan makeup of the 6-member commission to a 5-member commission, establishes a speech czar, limiting free speech, and creating a partisan commission with partisan enforcement priorities. This nearly 800-page bill needs more than one hearing, and it deserves a markup. This committee needs to hear from those who actually run our elections about what impact this could have. We should review the issues we saw during the 2020 election cycle and help states develop a better process. The American people deserve better from their elected officials. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Thank you for your statement. Without objection, other members may put opening statements in the record. In a moment, I will introduce today's witnesses, but just as a reminder, your entire written statement will be made part of this record, and we ask that your oral testimony be about 5 minutes. So that we can listen to each one of you and have a chance for each member of the committee to pose questions to you. We have today as witnesses Ricky Hatch, the County Clerk Auditor for Weber County, Utah, Ms. Stacey Abrams, Founder and Chair of the Fair Fight Action, Professor Guy Charles, Professor of Law at the Duke University School of Law, and the Maine Secretary of State, Shenna Bellows. I am going to turn to our colleague, Congressman Blake Moore, who is representing the 1st District of Utah. He's joining us for the express purpose of introducing Mr. Hatch, who is from his district. So, Congressman Moore, you are recognized for the purpose of introducing our witness.
Thank you, Chairwoman Lofgren, Ranking Member Davis, members of the committee. Appreciate being here. Thank you for holding this hearing to discuss how we can further strengthen our democracy and support trustworthy, secure elections. Understanding the role local governments play in administering our elections is fundamental to safeguarding them. To that end, I am honored to introduce one of my esteemed constituents, Ricky Hatch, whose commitment to excellence has been recognized time and again. Ricky serves as the Weber County Clerk and Auditor and provides world-class services to residents of Weber County, Utah, where I was born and raised. This is very personal to me. My mom worked for the Weber County Clerk's office when I was young, probably 8 to 10 years old. She introduced me to the democratic process. Last December, knowing how important this issue is, I asked Ricky and his team to painstakingly spend 2.5 hours with me, walking me through their whole process and truly find him to be a very credible source on this issue. As chairman of the Elections Subcommittee for National Associations of Counties, member of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission Board of Advisors, and the government, the coordinating council for the election infrastructure subsector, Ricky is uniquely qualified to provide insight into how federal legislation would impact elections on the ground. Fair and secure elections are the foundation of our republic, and Utahns are fortunate to have Ricky running our elections in Weaver County and providing best practices for leadership development to county officials across the United States. Ricky, thank you for being here. Thank you for having this hearing today. I yield back.
Thank you for joining us for that introduction, Congressman Moore, and we would ask members to mute whoever has a lovely dog, we're hearing it, and to mute our mics. I'll now introduce our other witnesses. First, Stacey Abrams, who I mentioned is the founder and chair of the Fair Fight Action organization that promotes fair elections in Georgia and around the United States, encourages voter participation in elections, and educates voters about elections and voting rights. Ms. Abrams is a political leader, a voting rights activist, and a New York Times best-selling author. After serving for 11 years in the Georgia House of Representatives, 7 as the Democratic leader, in 2018, Ms. Abrams was chosen as the Democratic nominee for governor of Georgia, making her the first African-American woman to become the gubernatorial nominee for a major party in the United States. Throughout her career, she has fought to make sure that every American has a voice in our election system. She has founded multiple organizations devoted to voting rights, training, and hiring young people of color, tackling social issues at both the state and local level. Ms. Abrams received degrees from Spelman College, the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, and Yale Law School. Welcome, Ms. Abrams. Next, I'd like to introduce Mr. Guy Charles, who is the Edward and Ellen Schwartzman Professor of Law at Duke University School of Law. Professor Charles joined the Duke Law School faculty in 2009. He is the co-director of the Duke Law Center on Race, Law, and Politics. He teaches and writes about constitutional law, election law, campaign finance, redistricting, politics, and race, and has published over 30 articles in journals, and is the co-author of 2 leading case books and 2 edited volumes. Professor Charles received his JD from the University of Michigan Law School and clerked for the Honorable Damon Keith of the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. He is a past member of the National Research Commission on Elections and Voting and the Century Foundation Working Group on Election Reform. Prior to Duke, Professor Charles taught at the University of Minnesota Law School from 2000 to 2009, where he also held the Russell M. and Elizabeth M. Bennett Professor of Law and served as interim co-dean of the University of Minnesota Law School from 2006 to 2008. This summer, Professor Charles will join the Harvard Law faculty as the inaugural Charles Ogletree Jr. Professor of Law. Welcome, Professor. And finally, we welcome Secretary of State Shenna Bellows of the great state of Maine. She is Maine's 50th Secretary of State, sworn into her first 2-year term in the position on January 4th, 2021. Secretary Bellows is Maine's first female Secretary of State. She previously served 2 terms in the Maine Senate from 2016 to 2020, representing 11 towns in southern Kennebec County. In the Maine Senate, she served as Senate Chair of the Labor and Housing Committee and served on the Judiciary Committee. She was a 2020 presidential elector in the Electoral College, and among her past works, Secretary Bellows most recently led the Holocaust and Human Rights Center of Maine. Additionally, from 2005 to 2013, Secretary Bellows was executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Maine. She co-chaired a successful 2011 statewide ballot campaign to restore same-day voter registration. She also previously volunteered with the Peace Corps in Panama and AmeriCorps Vista in Nashville, Tennessee. She holds a BA in International Politics and Economics from Middlebury College. So welcome, Secretary. We will turn first to Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch, we are happy to recognize you for about 5 minutes for your testimony. Mr. Hatch.
Thank you, Chairwoman Lofgren, Ranking Member Davis, and committee members. I truly appreciate the opportunity to testify on how we can strengthen American democracy. My name is Ricky Hatch, and I am the elected clerk auditor for Weber County, Utah. Elections are the foundation of our democracy, and election officials across the country embrace our duty to ensure that our elections are secure, fair, and trustworthy. All elections are local, and today I want to emphasize the importance of including states and counties in federal discussions about our nation's election system, and also to suggest ways to improve collaboration among all levels of government. Now, as a CPA, I can create a beautiful spreadsheet, but if you give me a paintbrush and canvas, I'll make an ugly mess. Now, I bring this up for a reason. Whether you're Claude Monet, Salvador Dali, or Bob Ross, you need a variety of brushes to handle a variety of needs. The variety of electoral brushes in our diversified and decentralized election system is part of what makes it so resilient and robust. In elections, as in art, a broad brush leaves streaks and gaps. A one-size-fits-all approach often fits everyone poorly. The first of 3 points that I will share today is that because counties are integral to election administration, federal policies should provide flexibility for local decision-making. All 9,000 election officials throughout the country have the same goal of secure and fair elections, and we share the desire to maintain the public's trust in these elections. At the same time, each county and state is wonderfully unique with different geographies, demographics, infrastructure, and even weather. And this variety underscores why the U.S. Constitution specifies that states identify and implement the most appropriate methods to serve their citizens. That Howell document tells us these laboratories of democracies, it tells them to select the brushes that best serve their unique canvas of citizens. Second, state and local governments are often faced with burdensome unfunded mandates. State and local governments are concerned that certain provisions in H.R. 1 add cost without providing ongoing federal resources. For example, states and localities would be required to cover ongoing costs for return postage. Under this new requirement, Weber County's election costs would increase between 30 and 50%. Now, it's helpful that H.R. 1 contains initial funding to cover several new requirements, but oftentimes funds get stuck at the state level. Now, these dollars are needed at all levels, but funds are especially vital to local governments who implement their elections. My final point is to respectfully encourage the federal government to engage in a robust federalism process with both state and local stakeholders regarding any legislative changes to elections. America's constitutionally decentralized election infrastructure recognizes that policies that may be best suited for one state may not be well suited at all for others. So please allow me to share a few specific examples of broad brush policies in H.R. 1 that concern state and local administrators. While the policy of establishing uniform standards for provisional ballots would work well for many states, it would burden states like Minnesota, whose system serves its voters well without provisional balloting. Requiring a specific quantity of ballot drop boxes could create instances of insufficient coverage in some states and excessive coverage in others. Nationwide same-day registration wouldn't affect states like Utah that already do this, but it would create significant hurdles for states whose infrastructure cannot accommodate same-day registration, and it may actually weaken their existing controls to prevent double voting. And while nationwide early voting would increase accessibility for voters, many vote-by-mail states would be dramatically expanding a service that doesn't really benefit their voters. For example, in my county, this requirement would increase my election costs by 25%, even though over 97% of my voters don't even vote in person. Rural counties would be impacted even more. So instead of federalizing election policy, I urge you to allow states and counties to retain ownership of their best practices, the unique electoral paintbrushes that best serve their voters at the local level. Now, I genuinely appreciate federal interest in bolstering the foundation of our democratic processes. Few things are more vital to the health and stability of our republic than secure, fair, and trustworthy elections. As you consider your options, I respectfully ask that you allow state and local election officials the flexibility to meet the unique needs of our voters and to directly provide resources to help us successfully implement whatever requirements you place upon us. Now, we stand ready to work with Congress, federal agencies, and states to strengthen our nation's elections processes. Chairwoman Lofgren and Ranking Member Davis, thank you again for inviting me to testify today, and this concludes my testimony.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hatch. Thanks for your testimony. And we will now turn to the gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. Stacey Abrams. It is an honor to have you here, and we would welcome your testimony at this time.
Thank you so much, Chairperson Lofgren, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the committee. The January 6th insurrection culminated from a nearly year-long disinformation campaign warning of a rigged election and a 20-year assault on voting rights, centered around racist and often baseless allegations of voter fraud. The 2020 contest has been audited, evaluated, and investigated, and Republicans, Democrats, and the majority of the U.S. Supreme Court have acknowledged no evidence of widespread fraud. A lie cloaked in the seductive appeal of election integrity has weakened access to democracy for millions by promoting voter suppression. Voter suppression is at its core actions taken by the state to discourage or prevent eligible voters from casting their ballots. However, the truth is this: Congress must reject voter suppression and act boldly and quickly to safeguard, strengthen, and preserve our democracy. As our nation becomes more diverse, the anti-democratic forces have focused their energy on peddling unwarranted and expensive voter restriction measures. According to the Brennan Center, as of February 24th, more than 253 bills have been put forward in 42 state legislatures seeking to restrict voting access. The legislation often comes with a disclaimer that these restrictions are necessary to restore confidence in voting. Yet the secretaries of state in these jurisdictions repeatedly rejected outcries of voter fraud or issues of election integrity just last year. As a Republican committee chairman in my home state of Georgia admitted during a recent hearing regarding anti-voting rights legislation, there is no evidence of widespread voter fraud, and this excuse is, quote, just in people's minds. For more than a decade, Georgians have utilized an array of voting options with varying degrees of access that have been harmed by voter suppression. Most of these advances, though, were made under Republican leadership, and these practices enjoyed bipartisan support and routinely resulted in the election of Republican and Democratic candidates. Sadly, though, Georgia Republicans have responded to record turnout by Black, Latino, and Asian voters in 2020 by filing more than 50 bills to make it harder to register to vote, to cast a ballot, and to have that ballot counted. Bills filed include repealing Republican-instituted automatic voter registration, severely restricting in-person early voting opportunities, and repealing no-excuse vote by mail. Georgia stands as a singular example of the legislative whiplash from defending the integrity of elections in November and January to these naked attempts to erect new hurdles for voters of color, young voters, poor voters, and other marginalized communities. Unfortunately, Georgia is not alone. In Arizona, growth in Latino and Native American voters has fostered legislation to severely restrict vote by mail, including criminalizing drop box ballot returns by immediate family members. Pennsylvania Republicans responded to record turnout by filing bills to repeal no-excuse absentee voting and eliminate in-person absentee voting. Dozens of other states are following these trends. H.R. 1 would not negate every harm posed by these legislative assaults due to the delegation of power to the states with regards to election administration. However, the provisions of H.R. 1 would create a uniform foundation for democracy in America that does not rely on geography. Expansion and protection of voting rights has long had a storied bipartisan history in America, despite attempts by leaders in both parties to thwart equality. Indeed, this body has come together after controversial elections to demand reforms that serve neither party, but instead speak to the will and the needs of the electorate. The For the People Act is a contemporary example of the courage of the many to oppose the fears of the few. H.R. 1 has broad-based and bipartisan support for its provisions to empower voters and protect our free and fair and safe elections. H.R. 1 would remove barriers to voting, set standardized guidelines, and provide states with the funding and equipment they need to administer and protect our elections. Congress alone holds the power to implement federal protections, power it has used before. As a former state legislator, I believe this body can and must respect the differences in states and allow them to decide how best to administer elections to meet the specific needs of their people. However, a citizen's fundamental ability to access our democracy, to register, vote, and be counted should not rely on their state of residence. This set of pro-democracy reforms will place power back in the hands of everyday Americans, of every political stripe, wherever they live. I thank you for this opportunity and look forward to this conversation.
Thank you very much for that testimony. Before I call on Professor Charles, we have apparently a procedural vote on the House floor. So members who need to go and take that vote will be excused. And we will turn now to Professor Charles. We're looking forward to your testimony.
Thank you so much, Chairperson Lofgren, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the Committee on House Administration. Thank you for affording me the privilege to testify before you on how we can strengthen American democracy. In 1964, Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote for the court, "The right of suffrage is a fundamental matter in a free and democratic society, especially since the right to exercise the franchise in a free and unimpaired manner is preservative of other basic civic and political rights." Those words penned by Chief Justice Warren remain as true today as they were when they were first written. Unfortunately, however, for too many American citizens, the right to vote remains ephemeral, even in federal elections, and the availability of the right remains far too contingent upon the capricious whims of political actors who are interested in acquiring and maintaining political power, not by convincing voters to vote for them on the merits, but instead by enacting laws that make it harder for citizens to vote. Now, fortunately, through H.R. 1, Congress has the opportunity, the power, and the responsibility to assure that voting is not a hollow right, and that it is accessible to all Americans who wish to exercise and to have their voices heard in our representative democracy. If enacted, H.R. 1 would be the most transformative civil rights statute passed by Congress since the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. H.R. 1 reflects and articulates a very simple principle. Voting is a fundamental right of American citizenship. H.R. 1 makes the right accessible by enacting the types of changes that we know will make it easier for citizens to vote and for them to have their consequential voice in our society heard. H.R. 1 shifts some of the burden of voting from individuals to the government and sets a national standard so that the experience of American citizens voting in federal elections is more consistent. But as importantly, the Constitution vests ample authority in Congress to regulate federal elections and to enforce voting rights. Allow me to emphasize two particularly strong and different bases of congressional authority. First, Section 5 of the 14th Amendment specifically grants Congress the power to enforce the 14th Amendment by appropriate legislation. This grant of authority not only authorizes Congress to guard against racial discrimination in voting, a power which Congress has, but it also enables Congress to enforce the right to vote and to render its exercise effective. The court has held on numerous occasions that voting is a fundamental right under the 14th Amendment, and the court has indicated that the right to vote is undermined where it can be diluted or made less effective. Thus, Congress can protect the right to vote under its Section 5 power. Second, and crucially, Congress also has the power under the Elections Clause, Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1. The text of the Constitution specifically grants to Congress the authority to enact legislation regulating congressional elections. This is a point that the court has long recognized. For example, when Congress enacted the Campaign Finance Reform landmark legislation, the Bipartisan Campaign Finance Reform Act, the Supreme Court in Buckley versus Vallejo, addressing the First Amendment challenges to that statute, noted in passing, the constitutional power of Congress to regulate federal elections is well established and is not questioned by any of the parties in this case. Additionally, and perhaps more importantly, the authority of Congress here is not co-equal to the states. In the words of Chief Justice Roberts in the 2019 case of Rucha versus Common Cause, Congress has supervisory authority. The Chief Justice described the power of Congress under the Elections Clause as necessary to check and balance the authority of the states. In addition to Chief Justice Roberts' words, consider also those of the late Justice Antonin Scalia. and a 2013 case called Arizona Intertribal Council of Arizona, and an opinion by Justice Scalia, the court stated, and here I'm quoting, "The power of Congress over times, places, and manner of congressional elections is paramount and may be exercised at any time and to any extent which it deems expedient. And so far as it is exercised, the regulations affected supersede those of the state and which are inconsistent therewith. Thus, the case law confirms the power of Congress over congressional elections in very broad terms. Congress has the power to supersede state authority in the context of congressional elections. With H.R. 1, Congress has the opportunity to assure that the right to vote is not dependent upon whim, caprice, geography, or race, but it is accessible to all voters who participate in federal elections. Congress has also more than ample the power to meet this opportunity and to help us build a representative democracy that works for all. Thank you so much for allowing me to testify this afternoon.
Thank you so very much for that testimony. And now we'll turn to our last witness, Secretary Bellows. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairperson Lofgren, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak before you today in support of H.R. 1, which is so critical to safeguarding the citizenry's participation in our great democracy. My name is Shenna Bellows. I'm Maine's 50th Secretary of State and the Chief Elections Officer for Maine. The daughter of a carpenter, I grew up in rural Maine without electricity or running water until I was in the 5th grade. I worked my way through college, waiting tables, working retail, and as a Subway sandwich artist. It is a great honor to be here today. The passage of H.R. 1 is a watershed moment for American democracy. For too many Americans across the country, participation in politics and service in elected office is out of reach, a privilege reserved for the wealthy instead of the constitutional right guaranteed in our beloved Constitution and Bill of Rights. It doesn't have to be this way. In Maine, my story is not unique. Our Senate president is a working class logger. Maine's Speaker of the House, the son of a single mom, was the first in his family to attend college. Our state legislature is economically diverse, with farmers, lobster harvesters, small business owners, mill workers, and teachers represented. I tell school children that in Maine, you can grow up to be whoever you want to be, regardless of where you come from or how much money you have. That's because our laws and policies, many of which are consistent with the provisions of H.R. 1, have encouraged broad participation in elections and public service by people from diverse backgrounds and walks of life. Democracy is stronger when it represents everyone and when everyone can participate. H.R. 1 is critical because it eliminates barriers and lifts up the voices of ordinary people in our democracy. H.R. 1 builds upon tried and true best practices already proven to work in the states, places like Maine and across the country. Those best practices in Maine include same-day voter registration, voting rights for all citizens, including people who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated, paper ballots with clear chains of custody, no excuse absentee voting at least 30 days prior to Election Day, online absentee ballot tracking, convenient and secure absentee ballot drop boxes, a public financing system for state candidates called Maine Clean Elections, and strong campaign finance disclosure requirements. H.R. 1 also provides a forward-looking vision and resources necessary for rural states like Maine to put in place the technology improvements necessary to make voting as convenient, accessible, and secure as possible for every citizen. The pandemic revealed serious challenges and opportunities to improve our election systems. Cybersecurity is increasingly important as we witness outside attacks on our elections infrastructure. Pernicious disinformation funded by dark money and foreign actors has also severely undermined public confidence in our systems. H.R. 1 is well crafted to help states like Maine meet the challenges of our time. The states need help from Congress to effectively and efficiently implement modernization to improve security and accessibility through measures like automatic voter registration, online voter registration, risk-limiting election audits, and modernization of our central voter registration systems. As Maine's chief elections official, my role is to guarantee that every Maine citizen, regardless of affiliation, background, location, or party, is equally able to exercise their right to vote. Our elections are administered by municipal elections officials across our state who work tirelessly to support the citizenry in exercising their right to vote. Maine consistently enjoys some of the highest rates of voter participation in the country. More than 75% of our voting age population participated in 2020. Over 62% of Mainers voted absentee. Public confidence in our elections and the results is strengthened through transparency and fairness. If the rules are fair and applied equally, people can have confidence in the fairness of the outcomes. HR 1 will move us closer to the goal of a more perfect union, and I'm happy to answer questions in the areas where we have direct experience, as outlined in my written testimony. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you so much, Secretary Bellows, and thanks to all of the witnesses. This is the time when members can ask questions of our panel for 5 minutes. Several members have gone off to vote, but I see that the ranking member, Mr. Davis, has not yet left. So, Mr. Davis, you are recognized for your 5 minutes. But you need Mr. Davis appears to be frozen on the screen, so we will turn to Mr.
Madam Chair?
Okay, you're good.
Yeah, awesome. Hey, thank you. First off, I didn't mention this in my opening statements. Can I ask unanimous consent to enter correspondence from 17 secretaries of state concerning HR 1, opposing HR 1, correspondence from former FEC commissioners opposing HR 1, and various analyses on this attack on the First Amendment written by the Institute for Free Speech? Can I ask unanimous consent to include them in the record?
Without objection, they're made part of the record.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Hatch, thank you for being here, and thanks for letting Utah's own Dudley Do-Right, Congressman Blake Moore, introduce you. He's the nicest guy, and we're so glad to have him here, and you guys are lucky to have him in Weber County. I don't think you and your election administration colleagues ever get enough credit, even though you're the ones who actually make our elections happen. I mean, I know election administrators work extraordinarily hard to make sure that there are no mistakes. How long have you served as the clerk auditor of Weber County?
I was elected in 2010, so just over 10 years now.
Okay, so how many elections have you administered in your career?
Probably about 25 elections, but I also count elections, presidential elections, as like 4, the equivalent of 4. So if that's the case, that's going to be probably like 30, 35.
That'd be 172 then, right?
That's right.
I see in your written testimony that you explain America's constitutionally decentralized election infrastructure recognizes that policy that may be best suited for one state may not be best suited for others. So I think it's fair to say the one-size-fits-all system mandated by HR 1 would cause grave concern in a lot of areas, right?
Yes, that's correct.
And you'd agree that these policies, as an election administrator, shouldn't be coming out of Washington?
No, I love the policies that we have in Utah. They work very well for citizens in Utah. They were developed by citizens in the state legislature in Utah. They serve us well, and sometimes we tweak them and we change them and make them better. But I wouldn't dare presume that Rhode Island or Maine or any other state needs to have the same laws as us.
Well, you would agree that the needs of voters in Weber County are, let me just mention this, they're different than those in Alaska's North Slope borough, right?
Absolutely. Weber County is a fairly small election or small jurisdiction geographically with about 265,000 residents. We do things differently and have different needs than residents in rural, large geographic areas.
Well, and that despite the attractiveness of any given policy, it's important that we keep election administration decisions at the state level to give local officials closest to the people the flexibility to serve their needs. I think we agree on that, right?
I totally agree. Election officials across the country share lots of information, best practices. But in the end, we say, that's a great idea. Let me see if it works here, because we have some unique circumstances and challenges that we have to overcome.
Well, I know Utah uses a secured vote by mail system, which requires voter identification during the registration process to ensure election integrity. Thanks to the hard work of you and your local local officials, that happens. Utah has made these and other specific policy decisions for the benefit of its citizens and election integrity. HR 1 would undo many of those, imposing a one-size-fits-all approach to election administration and really striking at the heart of election safeguards that maintain voter confidence in our system. Would you agree with that, Mr. Do you agree with that, Mr. Hatch?
Yes, I would. And one example is voting by mail. If we had to mail our ballots out 45 days before election, we actually tried getting closer to that date a couple of years ago, and it was actually problematic. And so we moved that back down so it was mailed just 3 to 4 weeks before the election. So yes, your statement's correct.
All right. With all your experience in elections administration, do you think it's even possible to achieve a workable standard requirement that no voter waits in line at an early vote center for more than 30 minutes? What would it take to comply with that requirement?
It would take gobs of money. It's very difficult to get close to knowing how many people are going to show up, because each election is different and each jurisdiction is different. And planning for that, we have some very sophisticated tools, but we still get surprised sometimes. And so the way we would accomplish that is by throwing much more additional resources.
Okay, well, we got a $2 trillion package we're supposed to vote on this week, and it doesn't have a dime for this. So that would be something in addition. We like local control. Might be a good policy idea. 20 to 25 minutes in my rural county. It's a lot smaller than Weber County to cast my vote early and on this past election cycle, because people were interested in voting and they had a chance to go. See here. How much time do I have left, Madam Chair?
Your time has expired.
Darn, I shouldn't have asked and kept going. I guess I'll yield back nothing. No time.
All right, thank you, Mr. Davis. Mr. Raskin, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, thanks so much, and thanks for calling this very important hearing. And I want to try to get to the heart of this question of the federal and state roles in governance of our elections that have been raised by our colleagues. And so I wanted to pose a question to Ms. Abrams and to Professor Charles and to Secretary Bellows. And let me just set it up like this. On the one hand, I think that their characterization of the issue really misses the whole trajectory of American history, where our constitutional and legislative development has been federal constitutional changes and legislative changes to vindicate the right to vote against the various paintbrushes that Mr. Hatch spoke about. I mean, one paintbrush was grandfather clauses, another was literacy tests and poll taxes. If you look at our constitutional development, the 15th Amendment banned race discrimination in voting. The 17th Amendment gave us direct election of senators. The 19th Amendment gave us women's suffrage. The 24th Amendment banned poll taxes. The 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18. We got the Voting Rights Act, which was the essential instrument for enfranchising millions and millions of disenfranchised people in the last century. On the other hand, they've got a point, because if you look at the 2020 election, President Trump, the most federal figure there is, was trying to override states' rights and state laws at every turn. He tried to essentially coerce the Secretary of State of Georgia, Raffensperger, to find him 11,181 votes, I think it was, in order to win the election. He tried to coerce the state legislative leaders in a number of states to overthrow the popular vote in the presidential contest in order to install electors for Trump. And then, of course, famously, according to the vast majority of the people in the US Senate, 57 of them, he incited a violent insurrection against the Union to try to force his own vice president to reject the certified popular election results in a number of states, including Georgia, Arizona, Pennsylvania, and so on. So I wonder, given that the federal government has generally been a champion of vindicating democracy in the popular vote, but in this last election, the president was a threat to the popular vote, how do we sort this out and determine whether or not we should be legislating, as I think we should be in this context, to guarantee everybody's right to vote, but to prevent bad actors like President Trump from undermining popular vote in the states all around the country. And Secretary Bellows, let me start with you, and then Ms. Abrams, I'll come to you, and Professor Charles.
Thank you, Congressman Raskin. It's an honor to be here. And I think you make an incredibly important point. Grounded in the Constitution applies to all Americans all across the country. And your right to register to vote, to cast your vote, and to be counted should not be determined by where you live. It should be equal and safe and secure all across this country. And we have a long and distinguished tradition of Congress setting forth standards and supports for the state through measures like the Help America Vote Act, like UOCAVA, the Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act. These are critical standards and principles that create a sense of fairness and participation across the country. And we are a nation of laws and of principles, and we must do everything that we can to safeguard this democracy against the individual ambitions of one particular person.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. I think, because I'm running out of time, let me come to Ms. Abrams.
I would simply add that I appreciate the work of Mr. Hatch. I served as a deputy city attorney supporting the municipal clerk as one of my clients when I worked for the city of Atlanta. But I've also grown up in Mississippi and in Georgia. I lived in Texas and in Connecticut. And the reality is that decentralization has been used as a pretext for discrimination. And the reality is that we do not have equal access to the right to vote, especially in states that have a longstanding history of using decentralization as an excuse to deny access to the right to vote to people of color, to the poor, and to young people.
So, Professor Charles, let me come to you. Would you agree then with Ms. Abrams that the threat to the people's right to vote can come from different levels of government?
Absolutely. The threat can come from different levels of government. And I agree with Ms. Abrams that historically the threat has generally come from the states and not the federal government. The federal government has been a protector of voting rights. So we've outlawed literacy tests as a consequence of nationalization and removing state discretion in order to minimize voting rights and voting power.
Madam Chair, but my time is up, but could I just ask unanimous consent to enter 2 letters into the record?
Go ahead.
One is from former leaders of the ACLU and First Amendment scholars writing in support of H.R. 1, and the other is a letter dated February 24th, 2021, to Congress led by Attorney General Brian Frost of Maryland and joined by 19 other state attorney generals writing in support of H.R. 1.
Without objection, those will be made a part of the record. We will now turn to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Loudermilk, for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank everyone for taking time to be here today. Before I begin my questions, I want to echo some of the comments of the ranking member, Mr. Davis, that he had made, and express my disappointment, my sincere disappointment at the lack of committee consideration for this bill totaling almost 800 pages. H.R. 1 was referred to 11 House committees, yet the majority can only muster 1 hearing with only 1 round of questions. We've heard that since we had a markup in the previous Congress, that we don't need to have one this time. But yet we do know that changes have been made to this legislation. If this legislation is as important as my good colleagues on the other side of the aisle, the majority is saying that it is, and it is so needed, then we need to have more vetting of this bill other than just 1 single hearing. And I would even argue that the 1 markup that we had last Congress was not even sufficient, as it was, as I considered then, being ramrodded through, this time even more so. And so if the majority is truly concerned, as was been stated, strengthening American democracy, I challenge them to begin with following regular order, which I would submit would be actually unique in this Congress, as we have seen so far. So on to my questions. And Ms. Abrams, good to see you. It's been a long time since we've been in the state legislature together, and you outlasted me there. I got 10 years in, you got 11. So just want to ask you a few questions. First of all, how many elections have you actually administered?
I've never served as administrator of an election.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. In your written testimony, you explained that Georgia saw record high turnout in the 2020 general election, including from communities of color, which was incredible. I think all of us, everyone here can agree that more voters voting is great for our republic. It's great for our nation. And I'm thrilled to see that an increasing number of Georgians are exercising their civic responsibility. I think that is extremely important. And understand your work focuses on ending voter suppression, as we've heard and read a lot about, and that you allege that the suppression continued during the 2020 election. So my question is, can you explain how you reconcile the record high turnout with allegations of voter suppression, particularly in light of Georgia's photo ID requirements for in-person voting?
So I would begin by stating that there has never been a direct correlation between turnout and suppression. The question is who is prevented from actually attaining access. And the very poor analogy I would make is to say that more people getting into the water does not mean there are fewer sharks. We know that voter suppression has existed not only in Georgia, but around the country. And in Georgia in particular, the suppression that we pointed out in 2018, that we litigated in 2019 and 2020, actually led directly to the resulting increase in turnout. Because a number of voters who'd been previously prohibited from voting because of exact match, they were given greater access because the exact match system was finally generally gutted because of the litigation and legislation that came out of our efforts through Fair Fight. In addition, additional litigation secured uniformity in the treatment of absentee ballots. We know that in 2018, there's a disproportionate number of people of color whose absentee ballots were rejected. Those ballots were accepted because we had a uniform system of cure that was agreed to by the Secretary of State through court order. On a number of issues, from a range of absentee ballot access to poll closures, we know that when we can defeat those voter suppression activities, more people can participate. In your district alone, we saw hour-long wait times that were decreased when we were able to compel Cobb County to expand the number of poll access points. We know that it does not mean that there is no voter suppression when we can mitigate the harm of suppression. But our mission should not be mitigation, it should be the destruction of voter suppression in our elections. And that should be I believe, the goal of every person in America, especially patriots.
Because I am running out of time. I appreciate that. But what you're telling me is that you took corrective action at the local level, at the state level, to make this thing work. My fear is if we do something federally, you pass something here, it takes forever to get it undone. And so in your opening statement, you also talked about Donald Trump with his bringing questions to the election for months caused people to distrust the election. I think a lot of there's issues on both sides of that, of many claiming that elections have been frauded. And I know you ran for governor in 2018 and you came very close to winning. It was a very well-run campaign. But I was just reading an article of NPR that was questioning whether you even conceded that race because of questions about the validity of the election. Have you conceded that race?
Madam Chair, am I permitted to respond?
You can. The gentleman's time has expired, but you're certainly permitted to answer the question.
There is an absolute and very clear distinction between my actions in 2018 and what we saw play out in 2020 and 2021. I began my speech on November 16th by legally acknowledging the sufficiency of the election, and I did not pose a single contest designed to make me the victor by throwing out votes. Instead, what I did was challenge the underlying system that denied tens of thousands of Georgians access to the ballot, which was proven through 4 successful lawsuits in 2018 and continued success at the federal court level over the course of the remaining year and a half. What Donald Trump attempted and what his supporters attempted was to actually throw out the votes of eligible Americans based on spurious examples and outright lies of voter suppression. There is absolutely no correlation between what I did, which is to increase access to the right to vote, and what he attempted, which is to limit those who were allowed to participate in our elections.
Well, and I appreciate that. And I was not trying to draw a correlation between you and Donald Trump, but I will add, Donald Trump did concede that race. So, Madam Chair, I know that my time has expired and I yield back.
and over, but we have a very light gavel in this committee. So, Mr. Butterfield, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me say good afternoon to my colleagues, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony today. In preparing for this hearing, I reviewed the bios of all 4 of our witnesses, and I must say that each of you is distinguished in your own right. And so thank you so very much for joining us today. I especially want to welcome my daughter's hero, the Honorable Stacey Abrams. Ms. Abrams, thank you for being an inspiration to young African-American women all across the country. And to Professor Charles, you clerked for one of my legal heroes, Judge Damon Keith from the Sixth Circuit. Judge Keith mentored so many young lawyers, including my dear friend Lonnie Guinier, who was my co-counsel in many voting rights cases back in the 1980s. And I can't leave out Ms. Bellows and Mr. Hatch. Ms. Bellows, you have a great American hero on your wall back there, Frederick Douglass, and thank you for your leadership. And Mr. Hatch, I can't leave you out as well. Utah is a very, very beautiful state. I was last there in 1952. That's a fact. Now let's get serious. I am a proponent of a 100% participation in every election. Ms. Abrams, what do you think are the most important changes that Congress can make to federal election laws to expand voter participation and ensure access to the ballot box for the most vulnerable communities?
Thank you so much, Congressman, and please give my best to your daughter. I would say first, it's automatic registration. Voter registration is the entry gate for participation in our elections, and too often it is the target of voter suppression activities. And in fact, a number of the bills we see moving through states right now seek to limit access to voter registration. Number 2, it's making certain that there is equality and equity in the ability to cast a ballot. That means maintaining a certain number of polling places, allowing early voting, because not everyone can vote on a single day between 9 and 5. With our diverse economy, we have to have a diverse set of options, and that must include weekend voting days, which Georgia unfortunately is trying to roll back. It means that we should also have secured opportunities for vote by mail. A pandemic should not force us into better behavior, but it certainly revealed the challenges faced by millions of Americans, especially those in states like Texas, Mississippi, and Alabama, that were still precluded from using vote by mail, despite the fact that they faced grotesque challenges from COVID. And so I would say that.
But as you're closing out, talk to me a little bit about waiting in line.
Yes,
it's unacceptable that we see voters standing in very, very long lines in the early vote and on election day. During your election cycle last year, there were numerous instances of Georgians having to wait literally hours to cast a ballot. What can we do about that?
And that goes to the point of both early voting, polling places, and absentee ballots. Georgia experienced between 8 and 10-hour lines, and that meant that we had people who were fainting, who were collapsing from exhaustion, simply trying to exercise their rights. But with standardized guidelines that require early voting, absentee balloting, and allow people to have access to the polling places they need based on the population, and those polling places being equitably sourced, then we can reduce the number of Americans, and usually it is Black Americans who face this. And I'll give you one last note, that according to Professor Jonathan Roden, where minorities constitute more than 90% of active registered voters, the average minimum wait time in the evening was 51 minutes. When whites constituted more than 90% of registered voters, the average was 6 minutes. This is a disparity and a discrepancy and discrimination that cannot be countenanced.
Thank you. Let me use my last minute to speak to Mr. Hatch. Again, Mr. Hatch, thank you for your testimony. Your state conducts its elections as all mail elections. You mail a ballot to all of the active registered voters ahead of the election. It is my understanding that some jurisdictions in your state have been doing this for nearly 10 years, with all jurisdictions doing it beginning in 2019. Utah has elected both Democrats and Republicans during that time, and I've known my share of them. Do the voters of Utah like having the option to cast their ballot by mail?
They absolutely do. They really appreciate the flexibility.
Thank you. Well, that was a short answer. That allows me to give back 30 seconds, Madam Chair.
All right.
I do have a unanimous consent request, if I can.
Yes.
And I'll read it. Madam Chair, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a statement of written testimony for the record from the Southern Poverty Law Center Action Fund.
Without objection, that is made part of the record, and the gentleman yields back his time. We now recognize Congressman Stile for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. HR 1, as we're all aware, is approximately an 800-page bill. It's probably the top priority of the House Democrats. That's why it has the title HR 1. And I would be remiss not to express my frustration that we're not holding a markup on this bill. Myself, I was not on the committee. I know other members on this committee were not members of the committee. I know Representative Ledger Fernandez was not even in Congress until this Congress. I think it would be completely appropriate, not only because this is substantial changes from last year, but the environment that we're in a post-COVID or during COVID world, ways that we could look to move forward. I think a markup would be incredibly helpful. I'm disappointed we don't have the opportunity to offer amendments and only are having this hearing today. I know, Mr. Hatch, you referenced that you worked at the county level on elections. Ms. Abrams commented that she did not administer election. Professor Charles, have you administered an election at the county or statewide level?
No, I have not.
Secretary Bellows, have you administered an election at the county or statewide level?
I am in the process of administering my first election at the district level. I have a record of just over 15 years in elections and voting rights work, but this will be
understood. But
my
at
first time.
At this time, you haven't
Sure.
previously.
This is my first term as Secretary of State. Thank you, Congressman.
No, nothing wrong with that. Just flagging that we're holding today's hearing. We don't have folks that have a history of administering elections at a statewide level, which I think would be helpful as we're exploring placing mandates on states at the statewide level. It would seem to be appropriate to bring in some folks that have that experience. Not that people won't be well suited in the future, but this is that evidentiary opportunity for us to ask how this law would impact states across our country. Let me dive in if I can, Secretary Bellows. In your stated testimony in Maine, we're talking about how this plays out at the state and local level. You talk about the staff levels, how many people we have in Maine. During the last elections, do you have any knowledge of folks that were waiting longer than 30 minutes in a substantive way across the state of Maine?
We have over 5, and so we do not have extended wait times, in part because 62% of our electorate voted absentee.
I'm going to retain my time. That's fine. No critique as to how Maine's doing it, but across Maine, you didn't have extended wait times across Maine. Was that because of a federal mandate, or is that because of how Maine chose to implement their laws in the state of Maine, meaning Maine made decisions that were best for Maine and seemed to work well, or was there a federal mandate that told you how to operate your election in Maine that allowed you to have that success in your eyes?
There are safeguards in Maine that are consistent with HR 1, like no excuse absentee voting, and the ability to cast your vote 30 days ahead of time.
Wisconsin has great elections as well. We have great opportunity for access. But I just want to be clear, in Wisconsin, it's because of the way we're running our states. It's not a federal mandate, and it sounds like that's also the case in Maine. That there's not a federal mandate. That Maine has passed laws that work well for Maine. Wisconsin's passed laws that work well for Wisconsin, and we have a history in the United States of allowing states to run their own elections. I think it's part of the importance of our integrity in our elections, not to have one size fits all mandates across our state. I'm going to shift gears here slightly, just because I'm limited on time. It's my understanding, Secretary Bellows, that you did take public funds for your most recent campaign for Secretary or for State Senate to the tune of roughly $74,000. Is that correct?
So I did participate in Maine Clean Elections, and I'm happy to talk about the small donor matching program. It's an excellent program that has won bipartisan support.
I'm just tight on time. I just wanted to confirm that you participated in that. What did you use the $74,000 for that were given to you by taxpayers in public funding in the state of Maine?
So our campaign used the public financing system for road signs, for literature to voters, for radio advertisements, for permissible campaign expenditures, not for anything that personally benefits any candidate.
Nope, nothing wrong with that. So that's how you use those funds. And if those funds were then available at the federal level, which HR 1 would allow, a candidate could use those to run negative ads, negative literature that they would want to mail. They could pay political consultants, and they could use taxpayer money to run for re-elections. I think that's a real important distinction, right? So in Maine, you use public financing, and then ultimately you've chosen to leave the seat that you ran for in the state Senate to take this appointment to Secretary of State. It seems like a great position for you, but taxpayers spent $74,000, and now my understanding is in the state of Maine, there's going to be another special election to fill that seat. Is that correct?
So in Maine, 67% of the Senate Republicans who were just elected used our public financing system, as did 74%.
I'm not critiquing how Maine runs their system. I think there's a real validity in allowing states to choose how to run their systems. I'm not a fan of public financing. I'm concerned mostly as to what would happen if at the federal level we allowed federal taxpayer dollars, or the way that we're working this through and claiming that it's buckets of fines. I think that's just an important distinction, that we all understand that taxpayers, that federal government money would be on the hook for us going forward. If I can just ask you one follow-up question here. I know you were the executive director of the Maine ACLU, and the ACLU put out a letter in opposition to HR 1 2 years ago, saying the bill in its current form would still unconstitutionally burden the speech and associated rights of many public interest organizations and American citizens. And it goes on from there. There's several objections in their letter. You may be familiar with it. Do you disagree with the ACLU, or do you think that they were wrong to oppose the bill 2 years ago?
The gentleman's time has expired, but we'll allow the witness to answer the question.
Thank you. I support the campaign disclosure requirements in this bill because I think they're vital to our democracy and getting dark money out. And I am aligned with some of the former ACLU officials who support HR 1 wholeheartedly.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California, Mr. Aguilar, is recognized for about 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this hearing, and thank you and all of the staff for the work in putting this together. Secretary Bellows, I'm going to do something a little different, and I'm going to give you time to answer a question. As we know, providing voters with methods, different methods to cast their ballots enables Americans to participate in democracy. While instances of voter fraud through absentee ballots are exceedingly rare, it is often used as a critique against this accessible method of voting. Can you walk us through the actions you take in the state of Maine to stop voter fraud, including how you implemented the use of absentee ballots?
Thank you. Absentee voting is a way to be sure the voters' voices are heard. So what happens in Maine is you can ask for an absentee ballot by phone, online, or via application. The clerk sends you that ballot. We have an online absentee ballot tracking system implemented in 2020. You fill out that ballot and you do sign the envelope. That's returned to the clerk. The elections officials open those envelopes. The signature is there for comparison, but it must be at least 2 officials opening those envelopes for processing. And those names are tracked against the voter participation list and entered into the central voter registration system. So it is virtually impossible for a voter to vote twice, but if they do so, they will be caught because of those checks and balances.
I appreciate that answer. Thank you. Ms. Abrams, you stated in your written testimony following the 2020 election how state legislators are introducing legislation that would further disenfranchise voters. These laws rely on baseless claims of widespread voter fraud and would directly impact voters of color. Can you speak to the components of HR 1 and how they would mitigate or prevent this assault on our democracy and ensure that Americans can exercise their right to vote?
Certainly. First, there is the right to vote, and that begins with the ability to register to vote. Georgia has enjoyed automatic voter registration, which is bipartisan legislation that was proposed by and adopted during my tenure in the legislature. This is one of the targets of this legislation. One of the bills intends to remove automatic voter registration from Georgia. A second challenge is making certain that there's access to early voting. Georgia has enjoyed an aggressive early voting program for many years. Under the legislation proposed, they would limit the number of days and limit the weekend opportunities for allowing people to vote. Number three, there is a challenge of absentee balloting. Georgia currently enjoys no excuses absentee balloting, which was introduced in 2005, adopted and enacted in 2006. It was introduced by Republicans and largely was used by Republicans for the preceding 15 years. This was the first year where Democrats, and that is largely comprised of communities of color, leveraged access to voting by mail. And now the proposal is to rescind no excuses absentee balloting in the state of Georgia. HR 1 would allow absentee balloting. It would permit automatic voter registration. In fact, it would require automatic voter registration, would require early voting options, would also require absentee balloting, and would set baseline standards that create a floor for behavior. I know there was an earlier question that raised the issue of whether or not this was necessary. And what I would point out is that Maine and Wisconsin may have, and Utah may have very good laws, but in the state of Georgia, like much of the South, we have required no fewer than 4 constitutional amendments to access the basic perquisites of the ability to vote. And so, yes, federal legislation and federal courts have been long necessary to permit actual access to voting for millions of Americans who happen to live in states where we do not have those who believe our voices should be heard.
Mr. Charles, can you speak a little bit to the disenfranchisement of voters and how that affects the ability to be heard, just like Ms. Abrams was talking about, such as automatic voter registration? How can we overcome, these hurdles, and what specifically would HR 1 do to overcome these barriers?
Thank you so much, Congressman. So HR 1 does a number of really important things. So as I mentioned in my testimony, one of the things that's actually really important is to shift the burden from voters to the states. One of the things that the political science literature has shown that when you have a number of different laws that make it hard for voters to vote, then the probability that the voters are going to vote is actually fairly low. And so if you actually want people to show up to the polls, then you make it as easy for them as possible. By making it as easy for them as possible, they show up to the polls and then their voice gets heard. And so HR 1 lowers the barriers of political participation, provides for uniformity, shifts the burden from the individual to the government. And one last point that's worth noting, it's interesting to think about how some states are doing well right now, and maybe it looks like they don't need this type of legislation. But we don't know what the future is going to bring. And many years ago, we thought, well, maybe it's only the states in the South. But in the last few years, we have also seen that states outside of the South are changing their laws to make it harder for people to vote. So this legislation raises the baseline, locks in good practices for the future, and guards against the types of voting changes in the future that will make it harder for people to exercise their right to vote.
The gentleman's time has expired, and we.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just ask unanimous consent to enter the following materials into the record. A February 8th article by the Brennan Center for Justice on voting laws that have been introduced across the country so far this year that was published February 24th that states state lawmakers have carried or pre-filed or introduced 253 bills with provisions restrict voter access.
Without objection, that would be made part of the record.
A second article, January 4th, a piece from the Campaign Legal Center entitled How HR 1 Will Help Us Achieve a Government for the People.
Without objection, so ordered.
And a last article, January 19th, a letter of support, of HR 1, the For the People Act from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, signed by numerous organizations.
Without objection, they made a part of the record, and we'll turn to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, a new member of our committee, Ms. Scanlon, for her 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Lofgren, and thank you for holding this important hearing. Over the last 30 years, I've been a poll worker, an election judge, and a civics educator. And for the last 20 years, I've been a voting rights advocate, working both as an election protection lawyer at my local polls and nationally with courts and nonprofits and government agencies to protect the right to vote. So this issue is really a passion for me. And this is to say, I've been in the trenches as we've seen this troubling and accelerating national shift away from generally bipartisan efforts supported by the Department of Justice and presidents of both parties to expand access to the ballot and make sure that all voices are heard. Instead, over the last decade or so, we've seen the rise of 20th century voter suppression tactics, including computer-assisted gerrymandering, voting roll purges, strict voter ID laws, the use of the red map strategy to flip state houses and therefore flip congressional seats, and phenomenal amounts of dark money to promote disinformation, weaponize social media, and pursue frivolous lawsuits. Under the guise of election integrity or election security, we've seen cynical politicians put up roadblocks to the polls in order to maintain power and avoid competing on their own merits. And unfortunately, Pennsylvania has been at the heart of this effort. Our voters have been the victims of many of these voter suppression efforts. Fortunately, many were repulsed at the courts, including gerrymandering and a strict voter ID law. So we were grateful in 2019 when our Republican legislature agreed to work with our governor and expand mail-in ballot beyond traditional absentee ballots to no excuse mail-in ballots. And we felt doubly blessed to have that available as COVID started to spread. But that was before the ex-president Trump figured out that he was likely to lose Pennsylvania and therefore started doing whatever he could to undermine faith in our election process. He said that if he lost, it would be because the vote was rigged. And then he just harped on that all the way through our primary, all the way through November 3rd, and then all the way through January 6th and beyond. We've had dozens of lawsuits filed, all of which made no sense. They've all been rejected, including this week at the Supreme Court. There was no proof of any fraud. This was propaganda that was repeated and repeated until it was believed by far too many people, including some members of the House. So, you know, there's no time like the present to get this bill across. We need to make sure that we have these protections in place, more robust protections than apparently many state legislatures are willing to put forward. And we really just need to move ahead. No, the time is up. We need a framework for the states to build upon. Obviously, there are going to be local variations, but there has to be a floor, and we have to meet that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about absentee voting because we've heard so much about how it purportedly can be subject to fraud, although there is no evidence to the contrary. Even the Heritage Foundation says it hasn't found significant evidence of this. And we obtained testimony from former Attorney General Barr that he had no reason to believe that there was a problem with it. So Secretary Bellows, Maine provides no excuse absentee voting, similar to what Pennsylvania does. Can you speak to the success of your system?
Thank you. Absentee voting in Maine has been extraordinarily successful, and that's because it reflects the way people's lives work, right? And it's a rural state. People may be commuting an hour each way to work. They may be balancing childcare commitments as well as work commitments. And so this process of being able to request an absentee ballot, whether it's online or by phone or through an application that you can download actually from our website, and then cast your ballot either through the mail or go in person and vote up to 30 days ahead of the election in person at your clerk's office. That is a convenience that Mainers have enthusiastically embraced across party lines, Democrats, Republicans, and independents. And because of these careful safeguards, thank you, we think it's been very successful.
Okay, I've introduced the Dropbox Access Act, which is part of HR 1, to help states provide drop boxes for absentee and mail-in voters. I understand Maine used them. How did they perform?
We loved our drop boxes, and I'm thrilled to see this be part of HR 1. over 200 of our municipalities installed drop boxes for absentee ballots.
Thank you. I see my time has expired. And if I could just, Madam Chair, ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a list of 60 individual endorsement letters from groups supporting H.R. 1, an endorsement letter from more than 150 national and state groups endorsing H.R. 1, and a report by Common Cause entitled Amplifying Small Dollar Donors in the Citizens United Era.
Without objection, those will be made a part of the record. I turn now to another new member of our committee. A gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized for 5 minutes. You have to unmute, though. You're still muted, Teresa. There you go. We can't hear you. Teresa, we're not. Well, I think while Teresa gets technical assistance, I will ask my questions, and we will get back to Teresa after she gets help from her able staffer there who's helping with that. Professor Charles, you had devoted much of your written testimony to the Constitution's allocation of election-related power. And I think there's been some confusion in the debate on this question. So I want to read the pertinent constitutional language and then ask you some questions about it. Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1 of the United States Constitution says this: the times, place, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. But the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations. Is there any confusion about who has the final constitutional authority over election laws?
No, I don't think there's any confusion with respect to Congress's supervisory authority. As I mentioned in my oral testimony, Chief Justice Roberts recognized Congress's supervisory powers with respect to congressional elections. So even though the states are the first mover, but Congress has the final word.
So just to be more specific, and just to avoid any possible ambiguity, is there or have there ever been any confusion at the Supreme Court over who has the final say over election laws?
No, not with respect to congressional elections, no.
Any confusion among the conservative justices at the Supreme Court on this issue?
No, as I also mentioned, Justice Scalia's opinion in Arizona Intertribal is an example of a conservative justice saying that Congress has very broad powers under the Elections Clause.
Any confusion in the academic community on this point?
Well, the academic community is often confused, but for the ones who are not confused, I think everybody recognizes that Congress has fairly broad power under the Elections Clause.
So in your testimony, you speak to the role that Congress should be playing alongside the courts in defending and protecting the right to vote. Do you believe H.R. 1 fulfills this responsibility for Congress?
I do believe that H.R. 1 fulfills this responsibility. I think that there are lots of things that courts can do, and great activists, such as the ones that are witnesses on this committee, have done a great job in going to courts to vindicate rights. But there's also a role that Congress can play. And a great example of this is the Voting Rights Act, in which the courts for a long time tried to protect racial discrimination against voting, but the recognition was that Congress needed to step in to enact a comprehensive statute and partnered up with the courts to vindicate voting rights. And this is what H.R. 1 is attempting to do.
Thank you very much. Secretary Bellows, I'm interested in Maine. Citizens who are incarcerated, who've been released from prison, never lose their right to vote. Can you share more information about the impact this protection of voting rights has had on the reintegration of formerly incarcerated citizens back into public life and society?
Thank you. In Maine, that's right. They never lose their right to vote. We at the state level provide assistance with voter registration drives to facilitate absentee voting by incarcerated persons. And what we see is it strengthens ties and engagement with their home communities. We think it's very important.
And do you have a view, given the experience in Maine, what the impact on this provision in H.R. 1 might have for America at large?
I think given the disproportionate incarceration of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, this is a step forward in disrupting white supremacy and increasing engagement with all of our citizenry.
I wonder, Ms. Abrams, whether you have a view on this. I remember hearing a person who'd made a mistake, had been convicted, paid his debt to society, got out, and he said he didn't feel like a real person until he had the chance to vote as an American. Has this been an issue in Georgia?
It is. Georgia is one of the states that unfortunately essentially creates permanent disenfranchisement for millions of Americans. And when you layer that against the fact that Georgia has, at one point, we had the fourth highest incarceration rate in the nation. We are now, I think, hovering in the top 10, even though we're only the 8th largest state in the country. The fact that we have more people on probation or parole, and in any of those states, any of the statuses, you are not permitted to participate in our electoral system. But research shows that those who are reintegrated, as the Secretary of State pointed out, when you are given access to the right to vote, when you are reintegrated into the operation of society, you are less likely to recidivate. And so it is not only good for our citizenship, it is good for our communities.
Thank you so much. My time has expired, and we'll go back to the gentlelady from New Mexico, who I think has fixed her system.
I think we're fixed. Everybody can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, well, I will say I am new to Congress, but I am not new to this idea and this beautiful thing we call democracy. And I came to Congress to protect what we love, and we love this idea, right? And it beats strong in America, as we witnessed with the increased voter participation that our witnesses talked about. But we also know that it is imperfect and that it needs protection and nurturing and improvement. And so I hope that we can all agree, all of the witnesses and all of us on this hearing, that every citizen, whether you're in Maine or Georgia or Utah or Nuevo Mexico, that every citizen, regardless of their age, their identity, their political affiliation, their zip code, their race, that they should have the right and the ability to vote. And that our goal should be to increase that right and that ability to vote. Now, Secretary Bellows, it sounds like you truly believe that increased participation strengthens our democracy and that that's part of your job. Am I correct?
That's right. Every citizen should have the right to register, vote, and have their vote be counted. It's fundamental to this Constitution and Bill of Rights.
And Mr. Hatch, would you also agree that that is something that strengthens our democracy? It's part of your job.
Yes, my job is to ensure that every voter who can legally vote, that they have that opportunity.
Yeah, and so that's what H.R. 1, my mind, is trying to do for us, is making it easier to vote so every citizen can participate. So, when we know it's necessary because too many people have obstacles to voting. And that's what we're trying to do, is to have it uniform across the nation that everybody has this right to vote. And one of the things that breaks my heart when I see it, and this is something I worked on in New Mexico and said, we had issues where rural America and Native Americans did not have access to the ballot because they were not doing early voting there. And so we spent the money and we required that we put those polls and we put the early voting out there. And so that they won't have to wait too long. And according to the Brennan Center, Latino and Black voters waited on average 45% longer than white voters. Ms. Abrams, can you tell us what the impact on voters are when they have to wait that long to vote?
Often voters, one, they face the very real health risks in the Deep South of standing or in the Sun Belt, of standing in lines for up to 8 hours. We had a number of people across the state of Georgia who fainted, who had felt exhaustion. And unfortunately, one of the bills moving through the state right now would prohibit providing water and food to those who are standing in those lines. We also know that people are more likely to leave lines because they can't afford to lose the wages. Often our communities of color are correlated with low wage working. And that means that if you were spending 4 to 8 hours in line, you were losing half to a full day's pay. And in states like Georgia and many states, there is no recompense for time missed to go and vote. You can't be fired for voting, but you also can't be paid for the time you lose. And so for many millions of Americans across this country, particularly those who are situated in the Sun Belt, the risk of this is that they not only do not vote, but it becomes a disincentive to encourage those in their communities to vote because the cost is literally too high.
Thank you for describing what it must be like, which none of us face here on this committee. None of us face those kind of long hours. You know, nearly 20% of my congressional district is Native American, whose right to vote was denied and actually litigated. Just the plain old right to vote was litigated through the 1960s in New Mexico. But even with that right, many still are facing difficulties because they don't have the kind of addresses that other people have. And Professor Charles, would you agree that we need to make sure that whatever kind of address you have, whether you're living on a Pueblo where they don't have regular street addresses or anywhere else, that we must have and allow everybody the right to vote wherever they may live?
I completely agree, particularly for vulnerable populations. As Ms. Abrams mentioned, the laws that make it harder for people to vote, whether intentionally, which some of them are, or intentionally, has a disproportionate impact on populations that are disadvantaged, and particularly Native populations. So it's important that everybody has access, no matter where you live, whether you have an address or not, and whether you live in the North or in the South, East or West. So I completely agree with that statement.
Thank you. You know, Latino voters cast 16.6 million votes compared to only 12.7 in 2016. This was like a 31% increase. Amazing. Ms. Abrams, can you tell us what would happen?
This lady's time has expired.
Okay, I'm sorry.
But I will say that it has been wonderful to listen to each of the witnesses. And I want to thank each witness for their valuable testimony. The members of the committee reserve the right to give additional questions to the witnesses. And if we do, we would request that you answer those questions in writing, and we would keep the hearing record open for your responses. So this is the end of this hearing. I would like to thank the members for their participation as well. And note that each one of you has contributed to our knowledge of this. I want to thank especially the two election administrators for taking time, Mr. Hatch and Secretary Bellows. Certainly, I think all of this, I served 14 years on the Board of Supervisors in Santa Clara County, and we had responsibility for elections. And in all my experience, election administrators just wanted to go right. Whatever their party affiliation, they just want to protect the voters and help them vote. And I appreciate that you want to do that as well. Our concern is more with the legislatures around the country than with the election administrators. So with that, we will thank you, and without objection, the House Committee on Administration will be adjourned with this hearing. Thanks very much.